Yeah. Yeah, I was looking in this law dictionary. They got what's called consent of minor. A minor cannot consent to a medical or surgical procedure to be performed upon him or her unless no kin can be reached, or if an emergency exists that will not permit time to reach the nearest kin. Consent of spouse. In medical jurisprudence, a spouse can give consent for a medical, surgical, or other procedure to be performed if the patient is unable to do so. Consent refusal of the patient or nearest the kin may refuse consent for a medical or surgical procedure to be performed. However, if the patient is a minor and it is the consensus of the attending physicians that the child's life is in danger as a result of such refusal of consent, a court order may be obtained to force the parent's consent. Consent written. Consent forms are given to patients to study and read before undergoing a hospital, medical, or surgical procedure. It is a universal practice to make sure the patient understands all the eventualities that can take place following a particular procedure and understands the risks involved. Such consent forms are signed and witnessed before procedures can take place. Yeah. Now, consent forms are something that hospitals have to use, doctors have to use, quite often before you have a surgery or something that's experimental. You actually have to give your consent for a medical procedure to take place. And that has to be witnessed. You signed and witnessed that I consent to what's going on. Now, let's say you file for dissolution of marriage and you arrested me 3 days later. Yes. And I have to respond to the motion of the plaintiff. Right. Because she petitioned the court for dissolution of marriage. And in my response, I did not consent to the dissolution. I said I didn't want a divorce. Then I documented that we were married in Kosovo. Now, when a court decides that they are not going to take into consideration the refusal of consent, and instead they decide that they're just going to go ahead and do whatever they want, then they're going to allow for a motion for default, and then they're going to allow for a motion hearing, and they're not going to pay attention to what the law actually says. They have violated my right to not consent. Now, when a court issues a protection order where I, as a respondent, was not given notice and opportunity to be heard, they've removed from my availability to consent or not consent to a court hearing. Now, the law specifically makes sure that the respondent is given notice and opportunity to be heard. Now, I can consent to that notice because I would or could have showed up in court. But when a court decides that they're going to issue a protection order that does not actually fit the requirements of the instruction form, here, let me read this for you again. Okay. Now, you will see here, Law Enforcement Data Protection Division. The law requires the order to say if the respondent received notice of the hearing and by what method. Now, as a respondent, I consent or do not consent to the decision making of those that are judges, commissioners, sheriffs, and every oath of office in the United States. When you give me notice and opportunity to be heard before you issue any court order, when you, the court, do not do what the law requires, you, the court, have violated the laws of the United States. Now, I know it's difficult to believe this, but when the court doesn't do what the law requires, The court is the criminal. When I am given what the law requires, I can consent or not consent to being in court. Now, I would like the laws of the United States enforced today. I would like the court to remove the protection order that did not allow me any consent to what the court had decided to do. Now, an example would be, let's say I went into the hospital and there's a doctor in there decided they're just going to cut my leg off. Now, I didn't consent to the removal of my leg, but for whatever reason, a doctor decided to cut my leg off. Now, in medical jurisprudence, when you do a surgery of that significance, the removal of the leg, and the patient is more than able to consent or not consent to the removal of a leg, it is such that if you were to remove the leg of a patient without their consent, they would sue the guts out of the whole medical practitioner. Now, this court system and this law enforcement and those that are legally liable for the enforcement of the laws of the United States have decided that they're not going to do what the law says. But as that citizen, I'm not consenting to what you had decided to do. So you're going to have to do what the law requires.